1936 probably was the most eventful summer, at least, in Cleveland's history. Not only the Expo, which was the biggest show Cleveland ever put on, but there were political conventions.
The RNC was important in that it did bring, I think, 13,000 people to downtown Cleveland, filled the downtown hotels, and every space they could find.
The middle of the Depression, 1936, and all eyes were on Cleveland. Cleveland had been the second largest industrial city before the Great Depression. The city had lost half its jobs, but that did not diminish the city's importance for the Republicans in the upcoming election.
The Republican Party wanted to take things back to what they had been like before the Depression. Well, so did everyone. Through the Roaring '20s, government was very small, and most of the apparatus of government, most of the expenditures of government happened at the state and local level. The federal government was a fraction of the size that it became after that time. And to look at it from our modern perspective, we wouldn't recognize the government before 1929, really, and especially before 1933 when Roosevelt took office.
1,001 Republican delegates, along with their staffs, came to Cleveland.
Of course, back then you had the soot, the fallout from industry. Buildings were blackened by the fallout from the steel mills. They cleaned a lot of the buildings. They had two things coming, so it was not really ostensibly just for one. I think it was because they knew the 1936, especially as the summer approached, was a big time for Cleveland. It needed to look good. And so there's this cartoon that shows the Terminal Tower taking a bath, which is a great image. I should say the convention center here was built in 1922. It was a showplace, something that really made Cleveland stand out. It was really one of the most impressive convention centers in the entire country. And Cleveland was one of the very foremost cities as a convention destination for a number of years thereafter. Certainly through the 1930s and 40s, it continued in that role.
While the convention was happening, Cleveland was also preparing for the Great Lakes Exposition to celebrate the city's centennial and to help the city get out of the Great Depression.
There were several World's Fairs in the 30s. There was a big one in Chicago in the early 30s, an even bigger one in New York at the end of the 30s. In the middle of the 30s, there were actually three. You might call them mini World Fairs. Cleveland, Texas had one, and San Diego had one. But Cleveland was the only one in the northeast part of the country, which was the most populous part of the country. In fact, we tried to get the whole region behind this. That's why we called it the Great Lakes Expo.
Mr. President, I have the honor to pin on you the official badge prepared for you as the honored guest of this convention.
I think the convention was 2 weeks before the opening of the Expo. So while they were getting things ready downstairs for the Expo, all of the exhibits in the basement of Public Hall, the Republicans were meeting upstairs. Public Hall and Music Hall share the same building and in a way share the same stage. There's a partition between the two stages. They could raise that curtain so they could seat people on both sides.
It came here in large part because of the efforts of Chester Bolton, who was a prominent Clevelander, prominent Republican. He was an Ohio congressman. And he was on the Congressional Convention Committee, and he was a tireless advocate for Cleveland, and he had been involved previously in the 1924 convention and helped secure that for Cleveland as well. So this was a repeat performance, basically, for Cleveland in bringing it here. So he was very influential.
Well, I heard about the Great Lakes Expo when I was still a kid collecting coins. There was a commemorative $50 issued on the Great Lakes Exposition in 1936, which was a couple years before I was born. I think that's another reason I was interested in the Expo. I think we're all interested in what happened just before we were born or just when we were born. We wanted to find out what the folks were up to back then, maybe. Or maybe there were things laying around the house from that time that piqued our interest.
Cleveland back then, as now, had a committee promoting the city.
One way they did it was that they tried to encourage local businessmen not to look so glum. They actually, you can read in the Plain Dealer that time frame that the Come to Cleveland Committee urged them to don summer suits, not to wear their dark gray wool suits into the spring and summer. We need to create more of a resort-like atmosphere here, which is really funny to read, but they said it, and I'm not sure, they may have been deluding themselves. Cleveland was not going to be Miami by any stretch of the imagination. The Come to Cleveland Committee really was trying to promote special events. So they had things like battle reenactments on the lakefront in Municipal Stadium and various other festivals that were seasonal. So they were trying to bring people downtown and bring people from outside the city to come in and maybe stay a day or two, spend money in the restaurants and the hotels and go shopping on Euclid Avenue, which was then the 6th largest concentration of retailers in the United States. So it was a very impressive place to come. You had 6 department stores within walking distance of each other. I figured it at one point, as best I can tell, there were 44 stories of department store shopping.
The big draw that summer was the Great Lakes Expo built on a landfill along the lakefront.
I was interested in the WPA, which played a role in the Great Lakes Expo. They had 500 WPA workers on the horticultural garden. There was another remnant of the expo. The horticultural gardens were put in just north of the stadium. It was part of the Great Lakes Expo. It was an effort to show Cleveland what might be done with the lakefront.
It took 3,000 workers to erect the expo in only 80 days. That included all the infrastructure needed from electricity, water, sidewalks, and all the other amenities needed for the exposition.
All the local companies, the hotels and the banks promoted the expo. Dudley Blossom was a prime mover for the expo. He's the man who raised the seed money. I saw one estimate that Dudley Blossom raised $1 million, and that was just to get things going, to rent office space and hire a staff. They needed a mover and shaker to really get the city behind it. That was Dudley Blossom, the man who is the namesake of Blossom Music Center today. A later estimate said that the entire plant probably represented about a $35 million investment. Lincoln Dickey was the man with the ideas. He was the visionary as far as how much Cleveland got out of that $35 million. Dudley Blossom used figures about bank deposits to indicate that we came out a few $1 million ahead in extra spending in Cleveland. But more important than that was the fact that it turned the national spotlight on Cleveland.
A spotlight that the Republicans shined on Cleveland a few weeks earlier.
Cleveland's still riding high in a way. Of course, in 1936, everyone in the country is still in the Great Depression, and they're feeling it more or less depending on their location. Some places fared better than others, and it's also true that by 1936, the policies of the New Deal under President Roosevelt had cut into the Depression a bit, more than a bit. So Roosevelt was hailed by many as a hero, a savior. He was at the helm when 6 million new jobs were created in his first term as president. So the country has a sense that it's coming out of the Depression.
We have seen these gigantic expenditures in this.
Prior to the Cleveland Convention, William Borah, who was a senator from Idaho, had been in the lead. He had won the majority of the popular vote. If you tallied it up nationally across all the primaries and caucuses, he had won about double the votes of Alf Landon. Of course, it's decided at the convention, and people could change their mind. The delegates did not have to support who won leading up to that. And there were a number of contenders, really, but coming into the convention, really it's Alf Landon, who's the governor of Kansas, and it's Senator Borah from Idaho. And Borah ends up coming out of Cleveland the loser.
Alfred M. Landon of Kansas having received a majority of the votes of this convention.
So that's the biggest thing really, is that Landon came in really running second to Bora and ends up being the selection of the delegates, and by a very wide margin.
The entire expo that first year took 135 acres of land. They started on the mall, practically just a few steps from Public Square, went all the way down the mall, down the bluff over the railroad tracks to the land between the stadium and East 9th Street. They had gardens north of the stadium. Sometimes there were events in the stadium, and the first year they also used Public Auditorium, which had a basement. There were exhibits in the basement there. In the upper part of Public Hall, they called it Radio Land, and there were national live radio broadcasts every night.
The Johnson Wax program with Fibber McGee and Molly.
Anything interesting in the paper, dearie?
Well, here's an interesting article on crop surpluses, Molly.
You don't say.
Yeah. Now take
If you
corn, for instance.
paid your way
Certainly,
into
we
the
can take it and
expo,
we can
you
dish
could
it out.
attend those radio broadcasts
serious. This
free.
writer says
You
that
were
if conditions
part of the
keep up,
studio
the small farmer
audience.
will be-
Then on the other side of East 9th Street was what they called the amusement zone. That went all the way to what's now Burke Lakefront Airport. In fact, they had a Goodyear blimp field at the end of that area. For $3.50, you could take a blimp ride over downtown Cleveland. And between the blimp field and East 9th, they had kind of fun exhibits. They had Cliff Wilson's snake show, for example. They had a sportsman's paradise where I think for a quarter they had a pond which they stocked with trout and pike and game fish, and for a quarter they gave you a baited fishing rod. You could catch your own dinner.
While the summer of 1936 wound down, the presidential election was about to take place.
When you look back at what was happening in 1936, even the Republican candidate, Alf Landon, was not ripping apart every bit of the New Deal. He actually liked parts of the New Deal. So he just wanted less of a federal financial footprint. But he wasn't saying the New Deal is all bad. He liked Social Security, so he didn't believe that the rich should bear the burden for paying more into the system. And that's where, Democrats and Republicans have long disagreed.
One fallout from the 1936 convention was how African Americans viewed it. They saw a lack of black representation at the convention. Many black leaders were upset by this, as were many newspapers. One African American leader said this would be the death of the Republican Party.
In 1936, the New Deal, even though some people found fault with it, it was very popular, and it didn't single-handedly cause us to come out of the Depression. It was actually World War II that brought us out of the Depression, because you spend tons of money preparing to fight an international war. You put everyone to work. Everyone who can lift a hammer is going to work.
At the expo, the election was not forgotten.
Well, Franklin Roosevelt opened it long distance. The very night the expo opened, he was due in Philadelphia to accept his nomination for a second term. So he opened the expo by pushing a button in the White House. But about a month later, he did come in person. Actually, he spent the day reviewing WPA projects around the city. The airport extension was done by the WPA. In fact, that summer, thanks to the WPA, it became, I think, the largest landing field in the world, at least temporarily. The Lakefront Boulevard was opened by the WPA that summer too, what we now know as the East Shoreway. And finally, they brought him to the expo grounds. They took his railroad car right down to the grounds. Don't forget, the railroad tracks were there back then as they are today. Gave him a tour of the grounds. He gave a short talk at one of the nightclubs that was part of the expo. Herman Perchner remembered this talk. He was the man who operated the Alpine Village nightclub on the Expo grounds. He remembered FDR saying, "I'm not going to make a political speech." And at that moment, almost on cue, a waiter dropped a full tray of dishes. So of course, FDR feigned surprise at that and got a big laugh out of that too. But after his talk, he got back on his railroad car, and the engine came down to pull it up the bluff and couldn't make it up the grade. But fortunately, there was a transportation pageant that was part of the expo, and they had historic locomotives. As part of that show, you could see a pageant about the history of transportation with the real engines that made that history. So they borrowed a historic locomotive, I think it was from the New York Central, and they hitched that up to Roosevelt's car, and that got him back up the hill and on his way. And there was a court of the presidents that was part of the expo, and we highlighted every president from a Great Lakes state.
The Republican Convention and the Expo were not the only events happening that year.
The socialists met in Cleveland. They nominated Norman Thomas for president. He was a perennial socialist candidate for president. The Townsend Revolving Pension people had their convention in Cleveland. They're the people who were lobbying for old age pensions. In a way, Social Security came out of their efforts. Father Coughlin, the radio priest, had his political organization meeting in Cleveland too. They had a big rally in the stadium that summer. Besides all of those conventions, well, the American Legion met later that summer too, in September. And American Legion conventions were always a plum for a city to attract, because they would bring 50 or 60,000 people at least into town. The Legion had two big parades down Euclid Avenue. One of them, and this was documented in various papers, took 11 hours to pass a given point. And the plain dealer noted they marched down Euclid Avenue and only broke one shop window. For the American Legion, that was considered very good behavior.
Roosevelt won by a landslide. Landon only won 2 states, Maine and Vermont. The Great Lakes Exposition also won. In 1936, on opening day, it drew 35,000 visitors.
See, it was a hit. They attracted pretty close to their intended audience. They came close to 4 million people the first year. That had been their goal.
It was so popular, they brought it back for 1937.
It was 10 acres smaller, because they decided not to use Public Hall or Mall B for the second year. They wanted to reopen Public Hall for the usual convention business. And Clevelanders complained about having Lakeside Avenue cut off, because Mall B and Mall C were both part of the first year expo. So they opened up Lakeside Avenue, they pulled the expo back to Mall C. There was a music show on Mall B. They moved that down to the lower grounds just outside the stadium. As I said, it was about 10 acres smaller, but they did have a few new acts there. The biggest one was Billy Rose's Aqua King. Billy Rose was the biggest producer on Broadway at that time. Lincoln Dickey, the manager of the expo, brought Billy Rose up to Cleveland in 1936. He says, "We're going to go with this next year. We'd like you to come up with a new show for it." He put a Broadway show on that featured an elephant. It was called Jumbo. So for the Great Lakes Expo in 1937, he put on a big water show called, and he coined this name, and he even copyrighted the name, called it the Aquacade. And he hired an Olympic swimmer, Eleanor Holm, as one of his co-stars. The other co-star was Johnny Weissmuller, who played Tarzan in the movies in the 30s. Both of them were Olympic swimmers. In fact, Eleanor Holm, the previous year, 1936, she had gone over on the same ship that took Jesse Owens to the Berlin Olympics. But Eleanor liked to have fun too. She used to tell reporters, "I like to train on champagne and cigarettes." And evidently on the way to Germany, she trained a little bit too hard. They had to carry her to her room one night, so by the time the ship arrived, I think in Bremen, she had been kicked off the team. But she had a lot of options. She was very attractive, and she got a call from Billy Rose. "I want you to be in my water show at the Great Lakes Expo." And the torso murders were going on too. I think during the expo, victims 3, 4, and 5 were discovered, not too far from the expo, maybe a mile away in Kingsbury Run. And of course, the safety director of Cleveland at the time was Elliot Ness. Elliot was a bit of a playboy. In 1937, second year of the expo, when Billy Rose was auditioning swimmers for the Aquacade, for some reason, Elliot Ness showed up to watch the auditions. Maybe he figured that was part of the job.
The lake was still pretty polluted back then.
When they were rehearsing it, according to one story, a dead cow floated up from the bottom and broke up the rehearsal. Billy Rose's Aquacade then was the big hit of the 1937 Great Lakes Exposition. Eleanor Holm and Billy Rose soon became an item, even though they were both married at the time. She started showing off a huge diamond ring, and the story was that Billy gave it to her. I talked with some people that worked for the expo, and they said nobody on the expo believed it. They said he's too cheap. He's always mooching cigarettes. Well, one favorite story of Cleveland newspapermen was when Fanny Bryce showed up unexpectedly in Cleveland that summer and caught Billy Rose meeting with Eleanor Holm. And soon after the expo, yes, they filed for divorce, and Billy married Eleanor Holm. Johnny Weissmuller, well, he behaved himself that summer. He was married to a Mexican actress named Lupe Velez, and she made sure she flew into Cleveland every weekend to watch over her Johnny.
They also had versions of Shakespeare's plays.
I'd like to say that was the most popular, but it probably wasn't. I think more popular was a nightclub in Streets of the World that had exotic dancers, including one named Toto Laverne, who was one of the great characters in the Great Lakes Expo. In fact, they had a picture of her in Time magazine. And as a result of that, she got a kind of an angry postcard from a churchgoer in New Jersey who said, in effect, "Shame on you, your soul is in danger." So a few days after she got that postcard, Toto marched out on the pier and threw herself into Lake Erie. Fortunately, there were some expo guards there, jumped in and saved her. Oh, there also happened to be some reporters and photographers there too. So we suspect that was a staged event, gave the expo, of course, more publicity.
What was the legacy of these 2 years when all eyes were on Cleveland?
The Donald Gray Gardens, of course, remained. A lot of Clevelanders still remember.
That lasted until the new Brown Stadium was built.
There was supposed to be one building, the horticultural building, right next to the gardens. That was supposed to be permanent. Unfortunately, that burned down a couple years later. There was no physical legacy in the original footprint of the expo.
I think the Exposition was a bigger impact because, for one thing, it had a second run. So that had more of a residual effect in that it brought more people into Cleveland for a more sustained period than the RNC itself did, which was just for a few days.
One of the visitors I interviewed had considered that question. He didn't think they could even do it today because of the expense. If it was a $35 million plant in 1936 and 1937, it would probably cost close to $500 million to put on today. They just don't do those large expos anymore.
I think it's one of those years that is maybe more important than the typical year because you did have these two major events. So that makes it a pivotal year.